The day had barely awakened when Amara stepped into the morning air, unaware that before the sun reached its height, her integrity would be tested in a way that could either save her life or shatter everything she valued. She carried nothing but the quiet dignity of a woman who had learned to endure more than she ever spoke aloud, a strength pressed into her bones by years of silent survival. And as she walked toward a job that paid too little for a life that demanded too much, fate placed something in her path that could have rewritten her entire destiny in a heartbeat. The settlement where Amara lived moved slowly under the pale morning light, the kind of soft glow that revealed both the tenderness and the hardship etched into the environment. She stepped carefully over the uneven ground, knowing each stone and crack from countless mornings before. Inside the small single-room home she shared with her mother, the thin curtains swayed quietly, brushing against the walls with a gentleness that felt almost deceptive. Her mother slept lightly, her breath shallow, her frail body curled in a posture shaped by illness and years of sacrifice. Amara had grown accustomed to checking on her before leaving, tucking the blanket closer around her, adjusting the small metal fan, whispering a silent blessing over her head, because caring for her mother was not a duty, but the last form of love she still controlled. She stepped away from the doorway with a determined calm that concealed the constant undercurrent of worry she lived with. Survival had taught her not to collapse under fear. Instead, she allowed routine to carry her. Routine was dependable, predictable, easier than imagining the future. The mansion where she worked demanded early mornings, long hours, and humility that often cut deeper than exhaustion, yet it remained her lifeline. Without it, her mother would have no medicine, no food, and no shelter. Without it, she would fall through the cracks of a world that barely noticed the poor to begin with. Amara walked with steady strides, the soft dust rising around her ankles as she reached the main road. A few vendors were already setting up their stalls, sweeping away leaves, arranging baskets, and greeting the day with familiar resignation. She nodded politely at a neighbor who carried a tray of roasted groundnuts on her head, offering a tired but sincere smile that concealed the ache inside her stomach. Food had once again been a luxury she could not afford the night before, but she had grown used to hunger. Hunger was a companion she had learned to silence. The road stretched ahead, quiet but expectant, as though it knew something she didn't. She adjusted the strap of her worn bag, feeling the soft clink of the cleaning supplies inside, a reminder of where she was headed and how far she was from the life she wished she could offer her mother. She breathed deeply, letting the crisp morning air settle her thoughts, until something lying near her feet disrupted the rhythm of her steps. At first she thought it was trash, one of the discarded items the wind often swept to the roadside, but as she bent closer, a subtle tremor moved through her fingers. It was a wallet, a thick, expensive, polished wallet that didn't belong to anyone who lived within miles of this place. She picked it up carefully, half expecting the owner to suddenly appear, but the road remained still, the breeze brushing lightly through the nearby shrubs. Her heart began to pound in her chest as she opened it. Inside were crisp notes, bills stacked in a way that suggested carelessness rather than desperation. There was more money in that wallet than she had held in her entire lifetime. More than her mother's medicine would cost, more than their rent, more than any opportunity she could ever dream of. The weight of it unnerved her. Her pulse quickened. For a moment her mind drifted toward possibility, toward relief, toward a life where she could breathe without fear gnawing at her ribs. But the possibility felt like a trap, one that would cost her something far more sacred than poverty ever had. She closed her eyes briefly, grounding herself in the memory of her mother's voice, the way she had taught her that integrity was the one possession no one could steal from them. She knew she couldn't keep it. Her hunger did not justify theft. Her desperation did not erase the truth she lived by. Returning the wallet was the only choice she could make without breaking the core of who she was. With trembling hands, She searched for identification, wanting to at least understand who she was about to face. A single laminated card slipped out, shining faintly in the morning light. She lifted it, expecting to see an ordinary man, someone she could meet without fear or complication. Instead, she felt the air around her shift. The face on the card did not belong to anyone from her world. It belonged to a man she had seen only from a distance, a man whose wealth could buy the entire settlement twice over. Her breath locked in her throat as the weight of that discovery pressed against her chest. And in that suspended moment, she realized returning the wallet would pull her into a life she was never meant to enter. Some paths are entered by accident, yet they lead directly into the arms of destiny, waiting quietly for the moment a trembling soul dares to step forward. Amara stood before the towering glass building, clutching the wallet like a burning secret, her heart pounding against the truth she refused to betray. And though she wanted nothing more than to run, her honesty dragged her into a world she had never imagined entering. The city air felt heavier near the tall offices, thick with the scent of wealth and power. Worlds distant from the dusty streets Amara was used to walking. The building stood like a monument carved from polished stone and gleaming windows, reflecting a version of life she had only seen in passing glimpses. She wiped her palms against her faded skirt, careful not to smudge the wallet she held. Every step toward the entrance deepened the knot forming in her stomach. She repeated her intention silently, reminding herself that returning what wasn't hers was not an act of courage, just a truth she was unwilling to bend, even under the weight of need. But the moment she approached the entrance, a uniformed guard stepped forward. His brows arched the instant he saw her clothes, his eyes narrowing with the dismissive certainty of someone convinced she had no right to stand near the building's spotless doors. He blocked her path with a small gesture, though his voice carried the condescension of someone performing a grand favor. When she explained that she had come to return a lost wallet, the guard laughed softly, shaking his head as if she had told a child's fantasy. Another guard joined him, their judgment heavy, their tone coated in amusement and irritation, treating her presence like an inconvenience rather than an act of integrity. Amara held her ground, even as their comments pierced through her pride. Every insult pricked at the tender parts of her spirit, but she refused to leave. She tightened her grip on the wallet, declaring firmly that it belonged to someone inside. Her voice wavered, but her resolve did not. The guards exchanged glances, muttering under their breaths about scams and village tricks. But before they could force her away, the elevator doors at the far end slid open with a soft chime. A tall man stepped out, his walk steady and composed, dressed in a sharp suit that radiated the kind of authority money often disguised as confidence. Employees straightened at the sight of him. His presence shifted the energy in the lobby, as though the room itself acknowledged his importance. He seemed lost in thought until he noticed the commotion at the entrance. His gaze followed the agitation of the guards, then stopped on Amara, her small frame tense, her hands clutching something tightly against her chest. He approached slowly, his expression unreadable. The guards immediately straightened, stumbling over excuses, but he dismissed them with a lift of his hand. His eyes rested on Amara, questioning, curious, almost cautious. She lowered her gaze, struggling to steady her breath as she extended the wallet with both hands. It fell on the road, she murmured. I didn't want it to be lost. He took the wallet gently, his touch careful, as though her honesty had weight he wasn't prepared for. He opened it briefly, verifying the contents, not with suspicion, but with a strange, quiet assessment she didn't understand. Then he lifted his gaze once more, studying her as though trying to solve a puzzle no one else could see. And after a long, unsettling silence, he asked in a tone too soft to predict, "Why didn't you keep it?" The question struck her like a wave she wasn't ready to withstand, freezing her in place. Because at that moment, she realized he wasn't asking about the money. He was asking about her. Truth carries weight only when someone chooses to believe it, and today, Amara felt her truth trembling like a fragile leaf in the hands of a man who held all the power. His sharp, assessing gaze moved from the wallet to her uncertain eyes, suspicion tightening the air between them like an invisible rope. And in that charged moment, she realized honesty was not always enough to protect the innocent. It sometimes invited a different kind of danger. The lobby, silent a moment earlier, had transformed into a quiet arena, every pair of eyes fixed on the wealthy man now weighing her sincerity. Amara stood with her shoulders tense, afraid to draw a breath too loudly. She had thought returning the wallet would end her responsibility. Instead, it pulled her into a confrontation she was utterly unprepared for. The man, whose ID card had revealed him as Jidenna Kafo, owner of the building she trembled inside, examined the leather edges of the wallet as though searching for a flaw, a tear, a clue that pointed toward wrongdoing. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but laced with a firmness that cut through the room like glass sliding across stone. He asked her whether anything was missing. There was no gratitude in his tone, no relief, only suspicion wrapped in politeness. Amara blinked, unsure how to respond to a question she had not anticipated. She told him she had not opened the wallet beyond identifying the ID card. Her voice was steady, but his expression remained unreadable, as though he was studying a puzzle he believed she had crafted. Then his words landed like a heavy stone on her chest. He asked her how much she had taken before deciding to return the rest. A soft gasp rippled through the lobby. The guard straightened, waiting for her reaction, expecting guilt, expecting collapse. Amara felt her breath choke in her throat, her fingers clenching at her sides as a wave of hurt washed through her. She had known the world judged people like her. Maids, girls from poverty, those who cleaned floors, others walked without noticing. But hearing the accusation spoken aloud by a man who lived behind glass walls of privilege cut deeper than she was prepared for. But instead of defending herself with anger, she lifted her chin slightly, choosing the quiet dignity she had always carried. She told him where she had found the wallet, how she had walked miles to return it, how she had endured mockery from the guards, and how she would rather starve than steal from another person. Her words were calm, her expression steady, not because she wasn't hurt, but because defending the truth didn't require shouting. Jidenna listened, though his brows remained drawn, his eyes shadowed with confusion and doubt as he searched her face for signs of deceit. When she finished speaking, silence clung to the room. The guards exchanged uneasy glances. The receptionist paused mid-typing. Even the air-conditioning hum seemed to hold its breath. Jidenna slipped the wallet into his suit pocket and reached for something inside. He withdrew a crisp stack of bills and extended them toward her. He called it a reward. Amara stepped back instinctively, the money stinging her eyes like an insult disguised as generosity. She shook her head slowly, feeling heat rise in her chest. She explained that honesty was not something she performed for payment, and that taking the money would cheapen the very truth she had fought to protect. She didn't want a reward. She wanted her intentions to stand on their own feet. Her refusal echoed across the lobby with a power none of them expected, soft, steady, and impossible to dismiss. For the first time since the moment he saw her, Jidenna's expression cracked, not with anger, but with a startled realization. As though her refusal had lifted a veil he didn't know he had been looking through. The guards stared in disbelief. The receptionist's jaw fell open. No one turned down money from a man like him. No one. Amara lowered her gaze and turned to leave, her footsteps quiet, but full of the self-respect she carried like armor. The room watched in stunned silence as she moved toward the door, her dignity trailing behind her, like the soft silhouette of a woman who refused to be bought. But just as she reached the exit, Jidenna's voice cut through the hush, firm enough to halt her mid-step. "You're not leaving," he said, making the entire staff swivel toward him in shock. "Not until you hear what I have decided about you." Sometimes it takes only a single act of quiet dignity to disturb the certainty of those who have never faced hunger. And today, that disturbance sat heavily on Jidenna's mind. He found himself strangely unable to look away from the maid who walked with nothing in her pockets, yet carried honesty, like a shield carved from fire. And for the first time in years, something in his world shifted, not because of wealth, but because of a woman who refused to be bought. Amara stopped walking, her fingers tightening around the strap of her worn handbag as Jidenna's voice echoed across the lobby. She turned slowly, afraid of being accused again, but the expression on his face had changed. The suspicion was gone, replaced by something she did not know how to interpret. Something like confusion, something like curiosity, something almost human. He gestured for her to return, and though her feet felt heavy, she obeyed. The guards stepped aside, their arrogance melting into a nervous stiffness, uncertain of what their boss intended. Jidenna studied her silently for several moments, not with dominance this time, but with the gaze of a man seeing a puzzle that refused to solve itself. He motioned toward a small seating area in the lobby, and though she hesitated, she followed, sitting with her hands pressed together on her lap. "Why did you refuse the money?" he asked finally, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. His tone was no longer sharp. It held a strange softness, one he seemed uncomfortable using. Amara swallowed. She wasn't used to speaking openly with wealthy men, especially not like this, with the entire lobby pretending not to listen. She explained quietly that her mother was ill, that she worked from house to house to pay for medicine, and that life had taught her that survival without integrity was just another form of ruin. Money could help for a day, she said, but losing herself would cost her everything forever. The room seemed to shrink around them. Even Jidenna's posture shifted, his shoulders lowered, his jaw unclenched, and his eyes softened in a way that startled some of the staff. He wasn't used to hearing such words, not from board members, not from investors, and certainly not from someone society expected to bow before wealth. Her voice carried no bitterness, only clarity shaped by hardship. That combination unsettled him. He asked where she lived, how she came to the city, what dreams she once had before responsibility swallowed them. Amara answered with careful honesty, her gaze lowered out of respect rather than fear. She spoke of her mother's failing health, the village she left behind, the long walks she took to reach her employers' homes, the blisters on her feet, that healed only to return again. She spoke of the nights she stayed awake to make sure her mother could breathe comfortably, and of the mornings she rose before dawn to clean houses belonging to people who never learned her name. Jidenna listened without interrupting. The staff watched him with disbelief. He never gave this much attention to anyone, let alone a maid. Yet something about her manner, her humility blended with quiet strength, held him in place. She didn't pity herself. She didn't dramatize her struggles. She spoke like someone who had learned to survive storms with steady feet and a steady heart. The more she spoke, the more he felt something unfamiliar settling inside him. Admiration wasn't a feeling he knew well, at least not toward strangers, but he felt it now, threading through his chest like a slow, surprising warmth. Her life was steeped in hardship, yet she carried herself with a composure he rarely saw among people born into privilege. She didn't beg. She didn't exaggerate. She simply existed with a kind of strength most people never learned. When she finished, she lowered her gaze, expecting dismissal or another accusation. Instead, Jidenna leaned back, slowly exhaling as though the weight of what he had heard was pressing on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. His eyes traced the lines of exhaustion on her face, the frayed edges of her dress, the quiet dignity in her posture. "You shouldn't be living like this," he murmured, almost to himself. The guards exchanged startled glances. He continued, his voice more deliberate now, carrying a tone of decision rather than observation. Someone with your character deserves more than scrubbing floors and struggling to survive. People like you are rare. Amara shook her head gently, unsure what he meant. She wasn't used to praise. It felt strange and heavy, like clothing tailored for someone else. Judena stood abruptly, pulling out his phone. His assistant, who had been typing at the reception desk, straightened immediately, sensing the shift in his mood. He gave Amara one last look, a look that carried something resolute, something that made the air tense with anticipation. Then he called his assistant closer, lowering his voice but not enough for the lobby to miss his words. "Prepare the documents," he ordered. "I'm changing her entire position starting today." And as the assistant froze in disbelief, Amara felt the ground shift beneath her feet, knowing nothing in her life would remain the same after this moment. She had never sat this close to someone whose decisions shaped entire companies, yet he leaned toward her, as if her words mattered more than all the noise in his world. And he, accustomed to rooms filled with polished voices, found himself listening to a woman whose truth cut deeper than any speech he had ever heard. Two lives built on opposite sides of fortune stood face to face, seeing each other without the armor of class for the very first time. Amara hesitated when Judena gestured for her to sit again, unsure whether the invitation was a test or a genuine request. She lowered herself slowly into the chair opposite him, her back straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Around them, the lobby had quieted in a way that felt unreal. Guards pretending to focus elsewhere, staff typing without typing anything, the entire room bending its attention toward the unlikely pair at the center of it. Judena rested his elbows on his knees, studying her with a calm that carried no threat this time. Only curiosity, shaped by something he himself seemed unfamiliar with. "I want to understand you," he began quietly. "Not because of the wallet, not because of the money you refused, but because there's something different about you, something I'm not used to seeing." Amara lowered her eyes, unsure how to respond. Compliments had never been part of her life. Most people barely acknowledged her presence, except to give orders or express frustration. But Judena wasn't speaking like a man impressed by charity. He was speaking like someone trying to understand a language he had never learned before. He asked her gently about her mother, her responsibilities, her childhood, and she answered slowly, carefully, choosing words that would not reveal too much of her struggle. She spoke of waking early to fetch water, of caring for her mother through nights of fever, of working in homes where she was treated like a shadow. She told him how she often skipped meals to pay for medicine, how she walked long distances to save transportation money, how she learned to stretch every coin until it nearly tore. But when he asked about her dreams, she fell silent. Not because she had none, she had too many, but because speaking them aloud felt dangerous, like exposing something fragile that might break under the weight of reality. Judena leaned back, sensing her hesitation. "You can tell me," he said softly. "For once, let someone listen." His words loosened something inside her. She breathed in, unsure whether she should protect her heart or finally let it speak. Then, with a voice barely above a whisper, she told him the truth she had guarded since childhood. She wanted to learn, to study, to understand more than the narrow world poverty forced her into. She wanted to build something that mattered, not for fame, not for wealth, but to give her mother a life she had never tasted. As she spoke, Judena's expression changed. Something softened in him, something almost reverent. He watched her with the kind of attentiveness he rarely granted to his own board members, noticing not just her words, but the intelligence behind them, the clarity in her reasoning, the quiet leadership in the way she articulated her thoughts. She wasn't educated formally, yet she spoke with a depth that made him wonder how many brilliant minds the world had dismissed simply because they were born in the wrong circumstances. He realized then that she wasn't just honest. She was extraordinary, and that realization struck him harder than he expected. "Amara," he said after a long, thoughtful pause, "what would you do if you had the chance to build a different life? If someone gave you a real opportunity, not charity, not pity, but a path worthy of your strength?" Her breath caught. No one had ever asked her that. She didn't answer immediately. She looked down at her hands that scrubbed floors, cooked meals, carried burdens, and wondered if he truly understood how unreachable an opportunity felt to someone like her. But then she lifted her gaze, and for the first time in her life, allowed herself to imagine dignity without fear. "I would take it," she said quietly. "Not for myself alone, but for my mother." Her voice trembled, but her eyes didn't. Jidenna nodded slowly, absorbing her answer as though it confirmed something he had already begun to believe. He stood up, walked around the table, and handed her his business card. Printed on thick white stock, her name handwritten on the back in bold, deliberate strokes. "I want you to come back tomorrow," he said, his voice carrying a firmness that made her pulse quicken. "Same time. There's something I want to discuss with you, something that might change your entire direction." Her heart thudded once, hard. She rose slowly, clutching the card with trembling fingers, unsure whether she should thank him or run from the weight of hope pressing against her ribs. She started to step away when he spoke again, one quiet sentence that rooted her to the ground. "Amara, don't be afraid to imagine more than survival." The words landed in her chest like fire and water all at once, burning with possibility, trembling with fear. And as she walked away, she knew nothing about her life would ever feel small again. The morning seemed to breathe differently, carrying a silent heaviness that settled across Amara's shoulders, as though destiny waited for her just beyond the polished glass doors. Every step toward his office felt like stepping across an invisible threshold, where fear and hope blended into something unfamiliar and dangerously fragile. She entered unsure whether she was walking into a trap laid by power, or into the first doorway of a life she had never allowed herself to imagine. Amara stood at the reception, hands clasped tightly in front of her, the business card he'd given her tucked safely inside her pocket. The office was colder today, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. The staff glanced at her, some curious, some dismissive, some confused as to why an underpaid maid had returned with such quiet determination. She felt the heat of their judgment crawl across her skin, but she kept her gaze forward, repeating the one truth keeping her steady. She had been invited. The assistant led her to his office door, knocked twice, and opened it with a respectful tilt of her head. Inside, Jidenna stood near the wide window, his silhouette outlined by soft, natural light. It fell across his suit without creating harsh shadows, washing the room in a calm neutrality that made her breath slow. When he turned toward her, there was no impatience, no superiority, only the stillness of a man with a decision already sealed in his mind. "Amara," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "Thank you for coming back." She sat carefully, unsure if she should speak first. The room felt too clean, too precise, the kind of place where people like her usually came for instructions, not conversations. She waited, every muscle attentive. He walked to his desk, picked up a file, and placed it in front of her, not harshly, just deliberately. "I called you here because I want to offer you something," he said. "A position, not as a cleaner, not as kitchen help, but as an assistant trainee in my company." The world seemed to tilt. She blinked, certain she had misheard. "Sir, I don't understand." "I know," he replied calmly, "which is why I want you to breathe before you panic." But she couldn't breathe. The offer felt too enormous, too unbelievable, like trying to hold water inside shaking hands. Her heart tightened with confusion. "Why me? I have no schooling for this, no experience, nothing." He rested one hand against the table, leaning closer, his voice measured and steady. "You have honesty, discipline, responsibility. All the qualities I want in someone who will be close to me professionally. His gaze softened. And you have a mind sharper than you think. Amara's fingers trembled. You barely know me. A quiet sigh escaped him, not frustrated, almost regretful. He tapped the file on the table. I learned more than you think. When she hesitated, he opened the folder, revealing documents, reports, and brief notes. I did a background check. On you, your mother's condition, your work history, even the households you've cleaned for. Everything confirms exactly what I sensed yesterday. Her chest tightened painfully. She felt exposed, vulnerable, almost violated, not because he meant harm, but because her entire life lay open in front of a man who lived behind layers of privilege and protection. You've survived more than some people twice your age, he continued gently. You've carried responsibilities no child should carry, and you've done it with dignity, not bitterness. His sincerity shook her more than his investigation. Sir, she whispered, voice uneven. Why? Why do you trust me with something so important? He leaned back in his chair, studying her with a quiet intensity that made her heart thud hard. Because, he said slowly, I see potential in you the world will ignore, unless someone gives you a chance. She swallowed hard, her throat tight, her mind racing in circles that collided between fear and possibility. What if I fail? He didn't smile. He didn't dismiss her fear. Instead, he met her eyes with a seriousness that felt almost protective. Amara, he said, his voice deepening with conviction. You're not being chosen because I expect you to be perfect. You're being chosen because I know you were never meant to stay where life pushed you. The words cut through her fear, like light-splitting darkness, shaking every insecurity she tried to bury. And as she sat frozen in that moment, she realized her life was no longer waiting for her to be ready. It was demanding she rise. Sometimes the wounds we bury under silence become the very strength others recognize long before we dare to name them. Where she saw failure and shame, he saw resilience carved into her spirit like a quiet, unbreakable truth. And in that moment, Amara began to realize her past wasn't something to escape, but something destiny had been waiting to reclaim. Amara sat rigidly in the chair, the file still open between them like a doorway exposing every chapter of her life she wished the world would forget. Her breath wavered in her chest, and she kept her eyes down, fearing what else he might reveal. She had survived too much, lost too much, buried too much. It felt dangerous to let someone with power peel back the layers she had fought to keep covered. Jidenna watched her carefully, not with judgment, but with a quiet contemplation that made the air feel heavier. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands thoughtfully. There's something you never mentioned yesterday, he began gently. Something I discovered while looking into your background. Her stomach tightened. She feared what memory he was about to drag out. Debts, failures, the days she couldn't afford food, the nights she washed tears off her pillow so her mother wouldn't hear. But instead, he said, You once led a small youth group in your community, didn't you? Her head snapped up, eyes wide with shock. Of all the things he could have found, she never expected this, because it was something she herself had tried to forget. He continued, voice steady, but warm. 3 years ago, a volunteer group helping neighborhood children with reading, homework, and food after school. You organized it. You kept it running for over a year. You managed donations, schedules, supplies. He paused. You were 16. Amara felt her throat tighten painfully. The memories flooded back. Children gathered around plastic stools, the sound of chalk scratching against broken boards, the shared laughter that made their hunger feel less sharp. Then came the day it all ended, when her mother's health collapsed, forcing her to abandon the group and take up multiple cleaning jobs just to survive. She swallowed hard. It wasn't leadership, she whispered. It was just helping where I could. No, he corrected softly. It was leadership. Real leadership. The kind that rises only when life gives you nothing except responsibility. His words felt like a hand gently lifting her chin, forcing her to see herself through a lens she had never dared to consider. She blinked quickly, trying to push back the sting building behind her eyes. "Amara, do you realize how rare that is?" he asked, leaning forward now, elbows resting on his desk. "Most people your age were thinking about clothes, friends, entertainment. You were organizing children, finding ways to feed them, giving them something the world didn't give you. Guidance." She shook her head slowly, overwhelmed. "It wasn't enough. I couldn't keep it going." "You kept it alive for as long as you could," he replied. "That's what matters." Her hands tightened in her lap. "But I failed them." "You didn't fail," he said firmly. The room fell silent, heavy with truth. Her eyes shone as she looked away, ashamed that he could see the emotion she fought so hard to hide. "When my mother got sick, I had to leave everything. I had to work. Her voice cracked. "I didn't have a choice." He exhaled slowly, and something in his expression softened even further, something almost admiring. "Amara, everything you've done came from sacrifice. And do you know what sacrifice is?" He waited for her to look at him. "It's leadership with scars." Her breath trembled. She had never heard anyone speak of her life like this, never heard someone look past the poverty, past the struggle, and see something other than survival. He stood from his chair and walked to the window, speaking as he gazed out at the city skyline. "You think you're here today because you returned my wallet." He turned back to her. "But you're here because your past proved you're capable of far more than cleaning floors for people who'll never know your name." Her heart beat faster, louder, filling her chest with a pressure she didn't know how to contain. She felt seen in a way she had never been before, deeply, painfully, fully. He walked back to his desk slowly, as if choosing his next words with precision. "The job I offered you yesterday," he said, "is not the entire picture." Amara looked up sharply. His gaze held hers with an intensity that made her breath stop. "Because I don't just want you working for me," he said quietly. "I want you working with me." The room seemed to shrink around her, her pulse echoing in her ears as his intention settled like a thunderous revelation. And before she could even form a response, she realized what he had in mind was far bigger than anything she ever imagined being worthy of. Some opportunities arrive like soft invitations, but others fall into your life with the force of destiny, demanding a courage you never believed you possessed. And when he spoke, his words did not simply offer a path, they pushed open a door she never imagined she could walk through. Amara felt the ground shift beneath her feet, as though the future itself had leaned forward to listen. He sat behind his desk with an expression that carried both certainty and a quiet hopefulness, the kind that suggested he had spent hours thinking about this moment. Amara remained seated across from him, her fingers lightly pressed against her knees, her heart beating with the cautious rhythm of someone afraid to misinterpret a blessing. Jidenna watched her for a moment before sliding a folder toward her, its contents neatly arranged and labeled with a professionalism she instinctively knew was far beyond anything meant for someone like her, at least in her own mind. Inside the folder were documents describing a community development program, youth education, vocational training, leadership workshops, health support, and financial literacy. Each point felt impossibly grand, as though touched by the hands of people who lived in worlds she had never stepped into. She looked up at him with a quiet confusion, unsure if the folder had been misplaced or if he was simply showing her something for reference. But he shook his head gently, reading the hesitation in her eyes. "Amara," he said, his tone grounding but warm, "I don't want you to just understand this program. I want you to help build it." She blinked, her breath catching. "Sir, I'm not qualified for something like this." "You're more qualified than anyone I've met," he countered, leaning forward. "This initiative isn't just about paperwork or strategy. It's About heart. It's about integrity. It's about seeing people as more than statistics or problems to fix. He paused. You've lived the challenges this program is meant to address. You understand them from the inside. And most importantly, you've proven that even when no one is watching, you choose what's right. Her voice trembled. But I don't have a degree. I've never run anything big. I'm just a maid. He corrected her gently. You are a leader who survived circumstances that would break most people. And you led children, without resources, without recognition, simply because you cared. That is leadership at its purest form. His words settled over her like a balm, yet they also stirred an ache in her chest, a mixture of longing and disbelief she had carried for years. She looked at the papers again, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the vision. Why me? She whispered. Because, he said quietly, this project needs a soul, and you have one strong enough to guide it. His voice softened further. I can teach you the business side. I can give you the tools. But I cannot teach someone to have the heart you already have. Amara inhaled shakily, torn between fear and the possibility that her life could shift into something she once only prayed for in the privacy of night. She had never been asked to build anything this large. She had never imagined being trusted with anything this meaningful. Jidenna rose from his chair and gently closed the folder in front of her, not to take it away, but to signal the next step. Before you decide, he said, there's something you need to see with your own eyes. She looked up, uncertainty weaving through her breath. See what? He held her gaze with a seriousness that stirred both nerves and anticipation within her. I want you to take me to your community, he said. Show me where your story began, because that's where our work will begin. Her heart stilled, realizing he wanted to walk into the world she had spent years trying to rise above. And as she whispered a hesitant yes, she felt destiny shifting again, preparing her for a truth she had never expected to face alongside him. Returning to the place that had once broken her spirit felt like walking into a memory she had spent years trying to outrun. Yet the moment her feet touched that familiar earth, she realized the soil still recognized her. The faces that once watched her struggle now lit up with a hope she never believed she could inspire, as though the entire community exhaled in relief at her homecoming. In their eyes, she was no longer the maid who left. She was the promise they thought life had stolen from them. The settlement stretched before her in the soft haze of the afternoon, its narrow paths winding between clusters of rusted rooftops and weathered walls patched together with patience and survival. Children ran barefoot across the dusty ground, their laughter echoing through the air with a freedom she remembered vividly, because she had once been one of them. Women carrying baskets paused mid-step when they saw her approach. Elders sitting beneath makeshift shades straightened their backs, squinting as though trying to confirm whether their eyes were playing tricks on them. But as soon as recognition dawned, murmurs rippled through the community, like wind through tall grass. Amara. She came back. She returned. She brought someone with her. Jidenna stepped beside her, his presence steady but respectfully quiet, aware that this moment belonged to her, long before it ever involved him. Amara inhaled, letting the thick, familiar scent of smoke, dust, and simmering stew settle into her bones as memories pulled at her. Hard days, hungry nights, and silent prayers whispered into the darkness. Yet this time, she walked with a strength she had earned through storms she never thought she would survive. As she moved deeper into the community, people gathered, forming a half-circle around her. Elder Mama and Kiru, the woman who once patched Amara's torn school uniforms, stepped forward with slow, yet determined steps. Her wrinkled hands cupped Amara's cheeks, her voice trembling with emotion. My child, you stand different. You carry light now. Tears pricked Amara's eyes, but she steadied her breath. I came because something is finally changing, she said, turning so everyone could hear. And I don't want this change to happen without all of you. She opened the folder Jidenna had given her, spreading its pages across a small wooden table as curious eyes leaned forward. She explained the initiative: free skill workshops, youth training, community leadership programs, and support for families who needed it most. She spoke with a confidence that surprised even her, each word rising from a place she had buried beneath years of silence. Her voice carried across the settlement with a conviction shaped by every hardship she had endured, clear, steady, and unshaken. People listened, first with skepticism, then with growing warmth. A few nodded, others murmured prayers of gratitude. Children huddled closer, their eyes shining with hope they had not allowed themselves to feel in a long time. Jidenna watched quietly from the side, his expression softening as he saw her transform, her posture tall, her voice unwavering, her presence magnetic. She did not simply propose an idea, she breathed life into a possibility their community had forgotten to imagine. When she finished speaking, a silence settled over the crowd, the kind that carries awe rather than doubt. Then, one by one, people stepped forward, offering support, ideas, labor, and even resources despite having so little themselves. In that collective movement, Amara felt something shift. She was not just returning home. She was becoming the strength her people had long needed. Jidenna approached her with a slow, thoughtful stride, his eyes fixed on her as though seeing a truth he had only suspected until now. He waited until the community dispersed slightly, giving them a moment of privacy. His expression was different, not the calm authority she was used to, nor the patient mentor she had come to trust. There was gravity in his eyes, something weightier than the proposal, something more personal, more urgent. He stepped closer and lowered his voice. Amara, there's something I need to tell you, something that will change more than this project. The seriousness in his tone chilled her blood, her heartbeat tightening as she searched his face for clues. And in that suspended breath between them, she realized whatever he was about to reveal could alter the course of both their lives. Some relationships begin with accidents, but the ones that change lives are shaped slowly, through trust rebuilt, dignity honored, and courage recognized in places most people overlook. He had met her in a moment of desperation, but somewhere along the path, he discovered a woman whose strength challenged every assumption he ever had about power and character. And now, standing before her in the quiet after the community gathering, he knew he wasn't just offering an opportunity, he was offering the beginning of something far deeper. The last voices from the crowd faded into the distance as children ran home, and elders lingered in soft conversations about the future she had just breathed into existence. The afternoon sun hung low, casting a gentle glow over the settlement that made the rusted roofs shimmer with a quiet dignity they rarely wore. Amara stood near the old mango tree, still catching her breath after speaking to dozens of people whose lives mirrored her own. Her heart throbbed painfully with gratitude and disbelief, for she had walked into this place, carrying years of brokenness, and yet they welcomed her, as though she had never left. Jidenna walked toward her, each step slow, measured, as if he were approaching a moment he had been rehearsing, but never quite mastered in his mind. His usually composed expression held a seriousness that froze Amara in place, her instincts sharpening the way they always did when her life was about to change in ways she didn't yet understand. He stopped a few feet away from her, hands clasped behind his back, gaze not commanding, but steady, almost careful. "Amara," he said softly, "what you did today, I've never seen anything like it." She exhaled, trying to soften the tension gathering in her shoulders. "I just spoke from my heart. These are my people. I know their struggles." "That's exactly why," he replied, stepping a little closer. "You didn't speak like someone giving instructions. You spoke like someone leading from the inside, and they listened, not because of me, not because of the company, but because it was you standing there. She looked away, her voice low. I'm not used to people listening. And yet, he said gently, they did. Silence stretched between them, thick but not uncomfortable, the kind that held meaning rather than emptiness. The wind carried the far-off sounds of mothers calling their children inside, pots clinking as families prepared their evening meals. For a moment, it felt as though the entire settlement held its breath for them. Jidenna inhaled deeply, breaking the quiet. Amara, I didn't bring you here today only to show you the program. She turned back to him slowly, her heartbeat rising in careful rhythm. I brought you because this initiative needs more than funding or management. It needs a soul. It needs honesty. It needs someone the people trust. Someone who understands the struggle from the inside, not someone who only knows it through reports and statistics. Her breath hitched. You could still lead it yourself. No, he said, shaking his head gently. I can support it, but I can't lead it, not the way it deserves to be led. He paused again, as though weighing the weight of his next words. That's why. His voice softened. I want you to be my partner. The word hit her like a sudden gust of cold air. For a moment, the ground beneath her felt unstable, not because she doubted her ability, but because she had spent so many years believing the world only offered charity or pity to people like her. Never equality, never partnership, never respect carved from someone else's faith in her. She blinked at him, shaken. Partner, as in equal? Equal, he confirmed without hesitation. Not a maid, not an assistant, not someone I'm trying to fix. A partner, someone whose judgment I trust, someone who sees what I can't, someone who can stand beside me, not behind me. Her throat tightened painfully as the memories of her life pressed against her. Nights she went hungry so her mother could eat. Mornings she scrubbed floors until her hands cracked. Afternoons she walked home exhausted enough to collapse. Every humiliation, every fear, every moment she doubted she mattered. And now, here was a man offering her a place beside him, not out of pity, but out of recognition. She swallowed hard. Why me? Jidenna stepped even closer, his eyes honest, unwavering. Because you returned a wallet full of money when no one would have known if you kept it. Because your first instinct was honesty, even when survival begged for compromise. Because you turned down a reward you could have desperately used. And because today, when you spoke to your community, you didn't ask for anything. You offered yourself. Her eyes burned with unshed tears. That kind of integrity, he whispered, is rare. And it's exactly what I want beside me. Her breath trembled as the weight of his words filled her chest, stretching against old wounds that had never truly healed. She lowered her gaze, trying to steady herself, trying to believe. This moment was real. Then he took one final step toward her, soft, intentional, filled with gravity. He looked straight into her eyes, his voice steady with purpose as he asked, Amara, will you stand beside me? The question struck her with a force she wasn't prepared for, silencing every thought she tried to form. And as her heart pounded against her ribs, she realized her answer could reshape not only her future, but his as well. Her acceptance didn't just lift her. It sparked a quiet fire that spread across every corner of the world she once believed would forget her name. Before their eyes, a maid who once scrubbed floors in silence was becoming a leader whose voice held weight, direction, and hope. And as the days unfolded, her rise became more than a personal victory. It became a testament to every soul who had ever been overlooked. The first morning after she accepted the partnership felt unreal, as if she were living inside a moment too fragile to touch. Amara stood in the company's main conference room beside Jidenna, surrounded by charts, maps, proposals, and a team of experts who had spent years studying communities like hers from a distance. For the first time in her life, she wasn't there to clean up after them, She was there to lead them. Her voice, once dismissed as background noise, now shaped decisions that would affect thousands of lives. The shift was so monumental she had to remind herself to breathe as she adjusted to the weight of responsibility settling across her shoulders. Their project, focused on rebuilding schools, providing clean water, and establishing women's training centers, began rolling out faster than she imagined. Jidenna ensured she had full authority over the community engagement side. He insisted she be the one speaking to villagers, designing outreach programs, and guiding how resources were distributed. She traveled from one rural settlement to another, meeting mothers who carried the same exhaustion she once knew, children who reminded her of her younger self, and elders whose blessings gave her strength. With each visit, her confidence grew. She learned to speak to large groups, to negotiate with contractors, to stand firmly when others doubted her strategies. Her determination became a quiet force no one could ignore. Within weeks, the results were undeniable. Wells were repaired, classrooms were renovated, workshops filled with women eager to learn stitching, crafts, and small-scale trade skills. Youth groups formed under her guidance, learning leadership and financial literacy. Every project carried her fingerprint, the empathy she had forged through hardship becoming the blueprint for change. Slowly, the communities began to transform, and with them, so did she. The response spread far beyond the settlements. Local newspapers covered her work, calling her the woman who rose from dust to direction. Bloggers wrote about her story. NGOs requested her insights. Students began sending her letters thanking her for inspiring them. People from cities praised her on social media, calling her a beacon of hope. Even employees in Jidenna's company treated her differently, no longer as someone who once mopped their floors, but as a leader whose opinion mattered. Despite the growing spotlight, Amara remained grounded. Each evening she returned to her modest apartment, exhaustion pressing into her muscles, but her heart full in ways she had never experienced. She often sat at her small wooden table, reading messages from villagers or planning next week's initiatives, feeling humbled by how far life had brought her. Sometimes tears slipped down her cheeks, not out of sadness, but from the awe of witnessing how integrity, once her only possession, had become the foundation of a future she never imagined. Then came the media day. Cameras were set up in the City Hall courtyard. Reporters lined up with notebooks and microphones, eager to capture her story. Jidenna stood slightly behind her, offering silent support. Amara answered questions with steady confidence, about transparency, about leadership, about her partnership with the company. Her voice remained calm even under intense lights and rapid questioning. But then, one reporter, an older woman with soft eyes, stepped forward and asked quietly, "Amara, when you were a maid, scrubbing floors and struggling to eat, did you ever imagine you would stand here today, leading a movement that has changed so many lives?" Amara froze, her breath caught. Her vision blurred for a moment as the weight of her past collided with the brilliance of her present. The crowd fell silent, waiting. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak, but emotions surged faster than words, rising like a tide she could no longer contain. For the first time since her journey began, she felt tears spill freely down her cheeks in front of cameras and strangers alike. And as the question echoed in her mind, she realized this moment would reveal a truth she had never dared to speak aloud. Her journey ended where it began, but she no longer stood there as a maid. She stood as a woman reshaped by the fire of her own principles, carrying the quiet triumph of someone who refused to betray herself, even when life demanded it. What she once protected in silence, her honesty, her dignity, her belief in doing right, had become the foundation of everything she had built, everything she had become. And as she returned to the small corner of the world that once defined her limits, destiny stood waiting with the calm pride of a teacher who had always known her brilliance would one day rise. The road to her old neighborhood felt shorter than she remembered, yet every step carried memories that tugged at her heart. Amara walked slowly, letting the familiar scents of roasted yam, dust, and afternoon charcoal drift through her senses. Children played along the roadside. Women folded laundry on open lines, and men sat under old awnings, discussing the same daily matters she had once overheard while sweeping floors nearby. Life here hadn't changed, but she had. Every breath she took felt heavier with gratitude and gentler with remembrance. When she approached the tiny house she once shared with her ailing mother, her chest tightened. The wooden door still leaned slightly to the left. The roof still bore rusty scars of rainstorms from years past, and the small patch of earth beside the house still held the scraggly plants she had once watered as a child. She stepped forward and touched the faded frame of the doorway, her fingertips trembling with the realization that this place, once the container of her hardships, was now simply the witness to how far she had climbed. She closed her eyes and let the memories rise. The nights she slept hungry but refused to steal. The mornings she woke before dawn to scrub wealthy people's floors. The afternoons she carried worn notebooks filled with dreams she never dared voice. The evenings she prayed for strength, not miracles. Every moment of her old life pressed against her, not with sadness, but with an indescribable reverence. She had not fought the world to escape her past. She had fought to carry her integrity through it. A familiar voice broke the silence. "You came back." Amira turned to see Jidenna standing a few steps behind her, dressed simply, his posture relaxed in a way she rarely witnessed in the corporate world. His eyes softened as he looked at her, not as a business partner, not as the maid he once misunderstood, but as someone who had transformed not only herself, but him. He approached slowly, hands in his pockets, stepping onto the same dusty ground she once walked barefoot. "I think," he said gently, "I needed to see this place too, to understand the soil that grew the strongest woman I've ever met." She lowered her gaze, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice. "This place," she whispered, "taught me everything, not by giving, but by taking. It stripped me until the only thing left to hold was my integrity." Jidenna nodded quietly. "And that integrity," he said, "is what saved me from becoming a man driven only by profit." He paused, emotion threading through his words. "Before you walked into my office that day, I had forgotten what true humanity looked like. I forgot what values meant when no one was watching. You reminded me." His confession struck her deeply. For a moment, she saw the weight he carried, the responsibility, the isolation that came with wealth, the silent distances that formed when people approached him for gain rather than connection. She realized that just as he had opened doors for her, she had unknowingly opened a window in him. They walked together toward the small bench outside her old home. Villagers passing by whispered her name with pride, offering nods and blessings. Mothers sent children to greet her. Elders raised their hands in silent prayers. She sat quietly, absorbing the warmth of her people, the acceptance she once longed for and now received without condition. Jidenna turned to her, voice softer than she had ever heard it. "Amara, I didn't just gain a partner in this journey." He exhaled. "I gained a compass, a reminder of who I should be. You changed the direction of my company, my choices, and my life." She felt her throat tighten. The truth was, she had never set out to change anything. She simply refused to lose herself. Yet somehow, that very refusal had become the force that built schools, empowered communities, reshaped policies, and awakened compassion in a man who once lived behind walls, made of glass and ambition. Her eyes drifted toward the horizon as the evening light softened. This place had once held her in the palm of its limitations. Now it released her with grace. She understood now that destiny does not reward the privileged. It rewards the steadfast, the truthful, the hearts that remain unbroken. Jidenna looked toward the village with her, his voice low. So, what do you think comes next? Amara smiled, a slow, knowing smile that carried the strength of every struggle she had survived. Something bigger, she whispered. Something we haven't imagined yet. For destiny, once awakened, never returns to sleep. It waits patiently for the next heart brave enough to follow it. And as Amara rose from the bench, the wind carried a quiet promise through the village air. Some stories don't end. They evolve, preparing their next chapter in silence. If this story touched your heart, show your support by liking the video. It truly motivates me to bring you more powerful journeys like this. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next emotional, life-changing story. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice keeps this community alive and growing. And don't forget to turn on notifications. Your next favorite story is already on the way.